In the stillness of a Transylvanian night, a dense fog crept over the jagged hills. The towering silhouette of Castle Dracula loomed like a dark guardian of forgotten horrors. The villagers below whispered of the vampire lord who ruled the night, but few dared to speak his name aloud. Jonathan Harker, an unsuspecting English lawyer, arrived at the castle, summoned by Count Dracula under the guise of a real estate transaction. But as the ancient iron gates of the castle swung open with a groan, Jonathan felt a chill deeper than the night air. Inside, Count Dracula awaited, pale, gaunt, and draped in robes that seemed to flutter in an unseen wind. His eyes glowed like embers, piercing through Jonathan's soul. Despite the Count's unsettling appearance, Jonathan tried to dismiss his unease. But soon, he realized that something far more sinister than he could ever imagine was unfolding. The castle was a labyrinth of shadows, where mirrors revealed no reflection of its master, and locked doors led to passages that twisted and wound into the abyss. As the days passed, Jonathan became a prisoner, his every movement watched by unseen eyes. His dreams were plagued with visions of pale women with ravenous eyes, their fangs gleaming under moonlight. One fateful night, Jonathan witnessed a terrible sight. Dracula, standing before an open window, his cloak billowing like a bat's wings, transforming into a mist that slithered into the night. He followed Dracula's trail to the castle's deepest crypt, where the Count lay in a coffin, his eyes wide open, yet lifeless. In his chest, a faint pulse of unnatural power beat, a heartbeat not of life, but of death eternal. Dracula rose, fully aware of Jonathan's presence. "You should not have come here, Mr. Harker," he hissed, his voice like the crackling of dry bones. "This is my domain, and soon it shall be the world's." Jonathan fled, but Dracula had already set his sights on London, a place ripe for the taking. Dracula boarded a ship, bringing death in his wake. One by one the crew vanished, their bodies drained of life until the ship arrived in England, empty except for the Count. In London, the horror truly began. People were found dead in the streets, their blood drained, leaving only puncture wounds as a clue. Mina, Jonathan's fiancée, became a target, slowly succumbing to the vampire's seductive influence. Her transformation was gradual, as she walked the line between life and death, her soul hanging in the balance. A small band of hunters, led by the learned Dr. Van Helsing, gathered to destroy the vampire once and for all. Armed with crucifixes, garlic, and wooden stakes, they embarked on a perilous journey back to Transylvania, where Dracula had retreated to his castle. The final confrontation was fierce, an eternal battle between the forces of light and darkness. As dawn approached, the hunters drove Dracula into the crypt. With one final strike, a wooden stake pierced the vampire's heart. His scream echoed through the mountains as his body crumbled into dust, his dark reign finally over. But as the wind howled through the ruins of Castle Dracula, one question remained. Had they truly seen the last of him? For in the far reaches of the night the shadows seemed to whisper and the legend of Dracula lived on. Years passed and the legend of Count Dracula became little more than a whisper carried by the wind. Mina, now free from the vampire's curse, and Jonathan had moved on, starting a family far from the horrors of Transylvania. Yet, despite their efforts to leave the past behind, Mina could not forget the nights when she felt Dracula's presence, his cold breath on her neck, his eyes burning through her soul. Unbeknownst to them, the dark forces at play in Dracula's demise had stirred something ancient and far more sinister. Deep within the earth of his crumbling castle, a strange occurrence began. The dust left by Dracula's destruction slowly stirred, as if moved by a force not bound by time or death. The soil of Transylvania itself had absorbed centuries of blood, hate, and dark rituals. Something began to regenerate. Something not quite Dracula, but born of his essence. Meanwhile, back in London, strange reports started to surface. Men and women appearing perfectly healthy one moment were found pale and drained of life the next. Their bodies bore no signs of struggle, no wounds, except for two faint punctures on their necks. The signs were unmistakable, but the world had moved on from such superstitions. The authorities chalked the deaths up to natural causes, unable to believe the truth lurking in the shadows. The vampires appearing in London were not just random victims of a curse. They were messengers, sent by Dracula's remaining followers, acolytes who had worshipped him long before he ever became a creature of the night. These followers had been silently working to restore their master to his full strength, and the time was drawing near for his resurrection. Van Helsing realized that the only way to stop Dracula's return was to destroy the very source of his power, his connection to the land of Transylvania. But doing so would require an unholy ritual, one more dangerous than any they had ever attempted. They would need to go back to Castle Dracula, deep into the crypts where his dark heart once beat. Jonathan, Mina, and Van Helsing made the perilous journey back to Transylvania, where the land itself seemed cursed by the vampire's lingering influence. Every shadow seemed to move. Every whisper of wind carried a sense of dread. As they approached the ruins of the castle, they felt it, a pulse of malevolent energy, growing stronger the closer they got. Inside the crumbling remains, the crypts lay waiting, but something far worse than they had ever imagined awaited them. The dust that once was Dracula had begun to reform, his shape now ghastly and grotesque, a twisted version of his former self. Dracula had not fully returned, but he was close. Too close. Van Helsing, with shaking hands, began the ritual to sever Dracula's connection to the earth. But as he chanted the incantations, the shadows around them seemed to come alive. Spectral figures, souls lost to Dracula's hunger over the centuries, emerged, seeking to protect their dark lord. As the spirits closed in, Mina stepped forward, the connection she had long felt with Dracula now pulling her closer to the dark energy. She realized the horrible truth. To stop Dracula once and for all, she would have to sacrifice herself. Her blood, tainted by Dracula's influence, was the final key to breaking his hold on the world. With one last, sorrowful glance at Jonathan, Mina offered herself. Van Helsing, with great reluctance, completed the ritual, and the castle shook as if the very earth was tearing apart. Dracula's form let out a deafening roar as it dissolved into nothingness, his connection to the living world finally severed. As the dust settled, the spirits vanished, and the oppressive darkness that had plagued the land lifted. Mina lay still, her sacrifice having saved them all but leaving Jonathan heartbroken. Dracula was gone, this time for good. But the cost had been high. The world would move on, and soon the tale of Dracula would fade into legend once more. Yet, in the darkest corners of forgotten places, some whispered that the night always remembers its master, and perhaps, one day, the shadows would stir again.